Good afternoon, Mixed Greens supporters and fans. This is Jessica Mathis. I'm the executive director of Mixed Greens, Savannah Incorporated. I have come to you today with Beloved Community Live Session 2, Letters from a Birmingham Jail, which is written by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963. This is part 2 of Letters from a Birmingham Jail. This is part 2 of Letters from a Birmingham Jail. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us unconsciously to answer and break laws. One ask, how can you advocate for breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws: just and unjust. I would be the brat to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws, and I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is rooted in an external law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber substitutes I in an it relationship for I-thou relationship and ends up relegating the person to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and awful. Paul Tillich of the Supreme Court, Paul Tillich said that sin is separation, is not segregation, an existential expression of man's tragic separation from the laws of the Supreme Court. For it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances for they are morally wrong. Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This difference is made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that the majority compels a minority to follow and that is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that results in being denied the right to vote and had no part in enacting it, devising the law. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the state's segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And these are some counties in which even the Negroes constitute a majority of the population. Not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong with having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such ordinances become unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. I hope you are able to ace the distinction I am trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as a rabid segregationist that would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that consciously or conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest form of respect for law. Of course, there is nothing about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced in the sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the grounds that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today. Because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany. Germany was legal, and everything Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that I had lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate for disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than the outright rejection. I had hoped that white moderates would understand that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fan in the purpose, that they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that white moderates would understand the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepts his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not creators of tension. We merely bring the surface, the hidden tension that is already alive, we bring it out in the open, where it can be seen and dealt with like a boil that can never be cured, so as long as it is covered up, but must be open with an ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tensions, and its exposure creates to the light of human consciousness and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unwavering commitment to the truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act of misguided populace, in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see that as the federal courts have consistently affirmed it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. This is part 2 of Letters from a Birmingham Jail. And this is taken from the University of Texas, Austin. You can Google Letters from a Birmingham Jail PDF. I will have part 3 next week. Thank you and have a nice day.